So thanks for being here. As Rebecca said, and maybe this explains why I do what I do, I also had the same feeling about active learning. But like every graduate student, at least in my field, when you're applying for jobs straight out of grad school, you have to say something about active learning on your teaching statement, or else you're afraid you'll get dinged for something. And I hadn't really done much. I was intimidated by it. I actually had a kind of antipathy toward it with respect to the way I liked to be taught when I was an undergrad. I liked the classes where some old fogey got up and lectured for an hour and a half. I really liked that. I didn't like the ones where it was gimmicky and we had to get into groups and hold hands and sing. And so I was the last person that you would have thought would have kind of jumped into this kind of method. And what happened is my first job out of graduate school, I was teaching a 3-4, so it's a heavy load. So even another kind of incentive to maybe not think about this kind of thing. But I had a mentor there who took me out to dinner the first day I was in town and said, you're going to be taking over our intro international relations course. I taught that when I was here first. And I did this really neat Cuban Missile Crisis simulation, and it really changed my life with respect to teaching. It made me kind of appreciate the students more, realize that they had a lot in them and those types of things. Creativity was abounding. And you should do something like that. And I was intimidated by her enough that I figured out quickly I had to do something. And my research deals with a number of cases, but one of them is the Kosovo Crisis, specifically the war part mostly. But I realized to simulate that in a classroom is tough. We don't have bombs, luckily. And so I developed a simulation where we would kind of simulate the run-up to the events that are more famous. Now, the ins and outs of the simulation you can kind of check out on your own. I have the handout there. I mean, I can say a bit about that if you'd like. I mean, one of the things that's different about it than I think some is let's see here if I can get to, is the way in which it is. Why isn't that cutting off? Let's try this. There we go. It's rather organic in the way it operates. I don't have kind of it's not a Model UN type scenario where I'm stopping them every 5 minutes and saying, okay, here's the new decision you have to make, converse, or something. They watch a film, and I'll show you on the syllabus here, if I can find that. You'll see here, I divide my syllabi into, weeks, basically. They'll watch a film leading up to this documentary on the crisis, and then they get all of their roles given to them by me, and then we take 2 days, essentially, to run the simulation, starting from a certain historical moment in time, and they are divided into kind of different groups, as you can see if you kind of fold down here. There's people in the US, there's people in Germany, there's people that represent Russia, the Albanian Kosovars, Serbians, those types of things. And they're all seated in different situations. And once things start going, it's incredibly organic. And the way we kind of keep track of what's going on is we have reporters that go out and figure out what people are doing, and they report it. And it becomes real once it's news. And so the students can see that. They can see what their other interlocutors are doing. Now, all this is to say is this is kind of a microcosm of my approach to active learning, which is I don't want it to be incredibly onerous for me. I don't want to be holding hands, and I don't want kids to feel like they're back in high school. I want them to feel like they're really owning it and they're doing something very interesting. So that kind of inspiration, or the way I approach it, it functions on a number of different levels. I rarely do more than one kind of active learning method in each course because I don't want the class to devolve into kind of a gimmicky type of atmosphere. I try to strategically place my active learning assignment in this case, this is for an intro course, to get the students about midway through the course, right after the first exam. They're stressed out. Some of them are going, why did I take this maybe? And then all of a sudden they're refreshed. So they do something really interesting that'll stick with them for a long time. All of a sudden, the lectures that may get, there's more fatigue toward the end of the semester, all of a sudden those are revitalized because you've done this and students are talking again. And it's also a good way for me to have kind of a writing assignment midway through the course, so that I don't have to pile on a huge essay at the end. You know, from intro courses, I like to do a little writing, but you know, it's hard to give comments and feedback to 40 students sometimes. And so this can be kind of a focused hit where they reflect upon what they've done in the simulation. But they use the class concepts that we've studied to reflect on what they've done. So they're showing me that they understand the class material, but they don't really know it. It's not onerous drudgery, right? They're talking about what they did. You know, then I talked to the German foreign minister, and he said, "Screw you," and I was like, "You're totally a realist," and you know, that kind of thing starts happening. So you're getting all the good stuff you get with active learning, plus a lot of other things, and that, you know, really filters down into the other ways I apply these kinds of techniques in different kinds of courses. Simulations, I think, are especially effective in intro courses because the students aren't jaded about their academic careers yet, and they're willing to take on a role and pretend and have fun. But it's not so useful, I've found, in maybe upper level courses where there's a lot of eye rolling about, okay, yeah, I guess I'm Bill Clinton or something like that, right? Not a lot of eye roll. You know, the upper level class, okay, you're making me be Madeleine Albright, that's funny, right? You know, and at this level, the simulation is it's pitching at the right level to feed into improvements in their writing. Because again, that component of the kind of fun aspect to it makes the writing less intimidating, inspires them to say something they care about all of a sudden instead of some theoretical thing that I force them to look at. They're applying the theories. And so the same kind of inspiration for what I do here, you know, in a kind of conceptual way informs some of the other things that I've handed out to you. So I thought maybe I'd run through those quickly and then maybe give kind of an overview of how they work in similar ways to take the load off of me somewhat, to improve the learning experience for the students without making it something that doesn't seem as rigorous as maybe some of the students are after, and that are geared in ways to improve other learning outcomes, other learning goals. Right now I'm teaching a course I designed here called, what is it called? Cyber War Robots and the Future of Conflict. So the students are pumped, they like the idea. A lot of computer science students, a lot of engineers that signed up because it said robots or cyber. And they don't realize I'm a just war theorist and a philosophy head at heart. And that I want them to write deeply about the human condition in relation to these kind of new technologies. I also don't want to have to, again, grade 30 papers at one time and not be able to give them extensive feedback. That's a big obstacle to assigning deep reading assignments. And I also don't want it to be a straight lecture the whole time, so I want some active learning. So I've combined kind of all of those goals into what I call a round table. I think I've been playing with calling it a panel discussion, but I think the round table is less scary for the students. And that's one of the sheets you have there is essentially, I copy and pasted this from the syllabus. So what this does is I've staggered these throughout the semester. I'll go down here to my schedule. So we have a round table every 2 or 3 weeks, about 3 weeks. And so basically I designed the topics to kind of, you know, basically it's maybe modules that cover a certain topic during that 3-week span, and the round table caps it off. I wanted the students to kind of own that cap, to own that kind of overview of what we were doing. I wanted them to be able to write in the class, and I thought this is a great opportunity. I can have them write papers in a staggered way, so I'm only grading 6 papers every 3 weeks instead of 30 papers once in week 7 or something like that. And they get some ownership over what they're writing about because I have them choose which roundtable they want to be a part of. So they look over the syllabus. Our first portion of the class is over the nuclear weapons revolution. We move on to robots and drones, 2 modules on that. Then we move on to cyber war, and then we do kind of this philosophical take on humanity's relationship to conflict and technology. And so there's something there for everyone, right? If you're more technologically oriented and you're a computer scientist, you sign up for the cyber war one, right? If you're a history buff, you sign up for the nuclear weapons revolution. If you're into philosophy and the future and humanity, you sign up for the last section. And I also encourage them, check your schedules, right? If you're loaded up in this particular week, don't pick that roundtable. I want you to have time to write me something that's good. And so what they do in this roundtable is they'll hand me a rough draft actually the day before the roundtable. It's due in the morning, to give me time to look it over and develop some comments. They'll meet with me before this draft is due, and they get a few points for that as well. And we talk over their topic, what they want to do. I try to give them guidance there. The rough draft's about 1,000 words. The final is going to be about 2,000. So they don't have to write a ton with the rough, but I encourage them, you need to have your entire argument laid out. Because the way these roundtables work is I want no stress on you, but you're going to be active. You don't have to give a presentation. You don't have to wear a tie and have a PowerPoint. But you're going to be sitting up in front of the class. And I'm going to give you the kind of comments you might get if you were like me and you were a professional at a conference. So we've kind of professionalized in the classroom a bit. And I say, and then I'm going to pose a couple of tough questions maybe at the end of my comments. And we'll go down the line, and then you'll have to answer those questions. And then we'll throw it to the audience. And because I've summarized your piece, maybe in a more sophisticated way than you wanted me to, because I'll draw conclusions for what you're writing, in the rough draft, you're going to get hard questions from the audience, from the class. What ends up happening de facto is we're getting a whole class discussion over the material we covered for 3 weeks. That I would have loved to have been able to go in and say, okay, we're just all going to discuss this stuff, and how did you feel about all these readings? They're doing it as part of this exercise and so they see all these benefits beyond just, we have a great classroom experience. The students asking the questions understand they're pushing their colleagues to make a better final draft, and that their colleagues will reciprocate if they do the same. The students on the panel understand I'm getting these comments, sometimes harsh comments, not because I'm an idiot, but because we've got smart people in this classroom, and I'm going to take those comments and improve on my rough draft. So, they're getting comments from me on a rough draft. They're getting comments as we meet before the rough draft, comments on a rough draft, written comments by myself, because I have time to do it. I only have 5, 6 papers each time. Comments in the roundtable discussion from me and from the students, and they take all of that, and then they have a whole week to write the final draft. And some of them come meet with me after the roundtable, some don't. But I've found I get improved papers, I get improved discussion in class, my grading load is lessened tremendously, and I can offer them, like I said, much, much better comments on their papers, and they have some ownership over the material. It also builds in, I know this is a struggle for, especially, I don't know how many of you are liberal arts here, and you want to have students kind of keep up with the readings and say things in class and be creative. Sometimes that's pulling teeth. Here I know there's at least 6 in the class that are doing the readings because they have to write a paper. And so if we hit a wall, I can go, Tony, I know what you're writing about. Tell me something, right? And so it's just built in to kind of make the entire semester run more smoothly. And we just get a break, right? The students that aren't writing for each roundtable, for a particular roundtable, know they don't have to do any readings for that day. It's kind of, we've been getting pounded for 3 weeks, and now we get to relax and ask questions and talk. So all of the kind of ways in which I don't want active learning to be gimmicky, I don't want it to be more onerous for me, I'm just flipping that. I'm making it so that it contributes to the rigor of the classroom work, takes the load off of me, because once I've set this up, this kind of format, I don't do any more work. Same with the simulation. That packet took some time my first semester, but I didn't have kids yet. And now I do, and I don't have to worry about it, and it's essentially 2 weeks out of the semester where I'm having a lot of fun. I'm not preparing lectures per se, and yet the students I know are going to get a lot out of it. So I do this in in a lot of my upper level courses when I want them to write really good papers. This kind of panel thing. I've tried the group project presentation. I've tried the single person presentation where they get up and tell the class about what they're doing. That's nice, and it does offer a chance for them to develop a skill that they may need someday. But I think you don't get as much with respect to improvement on their written work. You do get an atmosphere that becomes a little more nerve-wracking and maybe aggravating or oppositional. You know, I'm making you do this presentation, and you better do it right, and don't get nervous, and that kind of thing. I do most of the work. You know, it's not a lot of work, but I develop, you know, a little spiel about summarizing their piece, and then they realize they have to be ready to talk and to answer questions, but they didn't have to spit out their entire idea, you know, and remember it all in their head. The last one I'll talk about here, I haven't done here yet at RIT, so I'll be anxious. This is my second year. I'll be anxious to try this. I should say, here's a look at what you know, for the day of the roundtable, you know, I try to professionalize, as I said, so I've got it up on the board. Here's our writers, here's their titles, and you know, sometimes I overdo it a bit. I say, you know, we've got this brilliant piece by Zach Zakowski, and Zach's like getting red, going, oh crap, he thinks it's good. I've got to talk about this. But I think in general, it really, the whole class gets involved. It's like a little event. And I've even, when I've had more time in my life, I used to do flyers as if I was advertising for a conference. So and I would invite, you know, other faculty or students to come see it. So that's another option. You can do a lot with it. So the last one, I did quite a bit when I was at Ohio University before this gig. And I taught a lot of American foreign policy. I haven't taught that here yet, and that's part of the reason I haven't deployed this, but I will be teaching it in the spring, and I plan to do it. It's essentially Oxford-style debating. So for those that aren't familiar, it's usually teams of two, sometimes more, but I usually do teams of two. And they are debating for or against a motion that I develop. And the great thing about Oxford-style debating, I do stray from the standard format somewhat of, I forget the standard format. I think, you know, you offer your initial argument, and then there's a kind of back and forth between the debaters, and then there's an audience Q&A, and then there's a final rebuttal or statement. I don't have time for all that in a class, but we kind of stick to it. The genius about Oxford-style debating, though, is there's a winner, and it's not me who determines it. And this gets the students really riled up and ready to go, because I actually attach more points to the winner. Now, the winner is determined by a vote of their colleagues, their classmates, before the debate on where they stand on the motion, and then a vote after the debate has occurred. The winner doesn't have to have more people on their side. They just have to have changed more minds. So this also takes out the element of, oh, I think I got an unfair position to argue for. That was too tough. No one's going to agree with that, and the other side had it easy. Well, even if no one agreed with you beforehand, you might say you have it easier because you only have to pick off one person. The other side has to hold on to 30, right? And so there's all these kind of useful mechanisms built into it that encourage the students to get ready for it, to be excited about it. Because if they win, they get 15, I think the range is 13 to 15 points. If they lose, it's anywhere from 8 to 13 or something like that. So you're not, I mean, losing still means you might get an A, but it's not the absolute grade. And so much like in the roundtable, this is geared around a paper they're going to write. They have to write essentially a rough draft by which they will base their debate upon. And I'll see that rough draft before the debates, so I kind of know where they're going. I'm the debate moderator, you know, so basically they kind of present their paper, but in a debate format, so it's not quite as stuffy. You know, they can get hyperbolic if they want, or polemical and try to convince people of their argument. And then, you know, I'll offer some questions, the audience Q&A happens, and then a final response. So they're getting feedback from the audience based on whether they won the debate or not. And eventually, you know, feedback from me on their paper and during the debate, that all goes into a final draft. And again, the same way in which the roundtables are staggered, and the way in which students get to choose exactly what topic they want, that goes in here. So you'll see, you know, debate 1 is in week 2, debate 2 is in week 4. So basically every 2 weeks, you're debating a topic. This is really useful for me, especially, you know, with a topic that is politically charged, and with which lots of students, whether they know it or not, have kind of they think they know what the answer is, right? My parents said the Iraq War was a good idea, and it's a damn good idea. And if their commie professor tells them otherwise, he's a dirty red, right? I'm not telling them they're wrong. Their students are telling them they made a bad argument, and that gets through to them sometimes better than I can in a lecture. So here's an example of what that looks like, right? I've got this on the board, but the debate motion. This is one of the ones where I get students that go, I have to argue for this. I'm going to get slammed, right? At the time of the outset of the Iraq War, it was the right decision for the United States to make, and I point out, no. Again, even if you have no one on your side at the outset, if you change one mind and say something interesting like, well, they couldn't have known better, and they were well-meaning folks, and Saddam was crazy, and one person goes, you know what, I buy it. Sure, it was kind of a disaster, but at the time, makes sense, right? It was the right call. And then they win the debate, yeah.
How were the pairs selected?
They select those themselves, they do. So I actually encourage them, if they know someone in the class, and they feel like they want to team up, go for that. Sometimes that's not so useful, though, because they slack off. I also encourage them, pick something you think you believe in, right? And I've toyed with the idea of doing the opposite. And I don't know how I would make it work, because there is a usefulness in giving them something to argue for they don't believe in, right? They have to kind of understand the other side. Sometimes that happens by default. Someone's lazy and they don't sign up in time, and all of a sudden they're arguing for the Iraq War and they hated it. And that's really useful sometimes. But I think the ownership over the material is kind of crucial, at least to stopping the complaints about, oh, this is such drudgery, right? You decided you care about humanitarian intervention, right? You wanted to debate that. Yeah.
I was going to say, maybe you can hold them ahead of time. The question, are they for or against the argument, and then assign them randomly. If you have too many on the
Yeah.
side of the issue, assign them randomly to teams to argue the opposite point.
Right. No, yeah, I think those are all things to play with, because, like I said, I think there is a real use in taking someone out of their comfort zone, and they're not arguing about something they think they already, yeah. Then you might have fights, though, sometimes. I've had professors, colleagues of mine, that have talked about assigning a Palestinian student of theirs the Israeli position on Gaza or something like that, and fistfights break out at some point. But yeah, it's a good point. What else can I say? Yeah,
Talk a little bit
sure.
about this simulation. You had
Sure.
said that before you had other obligations in the evenings, you were able to pull this packet together. Can you talk a little bit about what that
Sure.
entails?
Well, like I said, this is based off my research, so I had a bit of a head start. And honestly, the hardest part was figuring out the logistics of it, how this would work, because I started out with this kind of standard decision tree model where, okay, let me imagine 4 options, and if they decide option 1, then they've got these other 4 options, 2, and then all of a sudden you're at 170 options after 2 rounds of discussion or something like that, right? So that seemed to me kind of impossible, and something that was as complex and nuanced as this. And I wanted them to be able to take it somewhere that was kind of radically different maybe than what actually happened. And so what I did is, I picked out the most important, actors in the real event, and they'll see them in the frontline documentary, so they get a sense of how to embody that person. But I encourage them, you don't have to make the same decisions. You just have to work within the bounds of reality, right? Madeleine Albright would not say, we should nuke Russia, right, over Kosovo. She might, I don't know. But she might have been less hawkish, right? A different version of her that woke up on a different side of the bed or something like that. And so I encourage them to think about their actor from their own ethical kind of commitments within the constraints of their institutional role. So they get a sense of the institutional role, their personality from the documentary. And during the documentary, they meet with me. I have each of them come out individually during the documentary, and we talk about what it'll be like, what they're expected to do, who they should be kind of aware of, or who they should be talking with. So that takes away some of the trepidation about how organic this is. Because I have had students that come up to me and say, I don't understand how this is going to work. Like, we're just going to start and then we make decisions. And yeah, you guys make decisions, right? To help that process not be too chaotic, I have set up some rules for who can, usually I run this in a big auditorium in Liberal Arts Hall, the A205 or whatever. So the Americans are sitting in one corner, the Europeans in another, my international organizations are in the middle, Russia and China are sitting over here causing trouble, the Serbs and the Albanians are over here doing their thing, and only a few members from each group can actually get up and go talk to certain others. Other than that, you have to delegate, which also forces certain members to pay more attention to the news feed about what's going on. Because if everyone was trying to talk to everyone, the whole thing does kind of devolve into madness eventually. And so you'll see here, Bill Clinton's got Holbrooke and Albright and Chris Hill that he can send out to do his bidding. And they only have certain members of the simulation they can talk with. So they know at the outset coming in, I need to figure out, if I'm Albright, how do I squeeze Europe, Russia, and China? What are their interests? How do I leverage my goals with respect to what they want? And likewise for Holbrooke, he knows he's going to be more concentrating on the Serbians and the Kosovars, and maybe sometimes with the Russians and the Chinese. So they're doing this. We start with the Roc Massacre on January 15th of '99, which really got NATO for the first time talking seriously about using force. The reason, and I emphasize this, the reason they started talking seriously about using force was purely for a very, very much ethical kind of action by the observer on the ground who was strongly advised by the Serbian authorities, do not go see this little town where there's reports of a massacre because we might kill you. And you don't have weapons. And he went there anyways, and he got on TV, and he said, this is a crime against humanity. And those are magic words. Once you say that, a whole kind of apparatus starts coming into play. And so NATO starts talking seriously. So we started with that initial decision, but I tell the person who plays that role, it's up to you. You describe it how you'd like. And then we'll have an interesting kind of case study of how things would have gone differently if you would have been a wimp and said, it's just kind of some skirmishes, I don't know, right? Or if you go full bore and say, I think we got a genocide in the offing soon, right? That really puts the afterburners on. So that's the starting point. And they all know, they all have kind of a detailed background that I've written up with respect to where people stand before this event happens, what's led up to it on the ground, and those types of things. So they've read all this, and then we start. And I tell them all, let's take 10 minutes at the outset to kind of converse with your own groups, figure out where you stand, and then start making statements to the media, and then start going to talk with other groups. But once that happens, it is back and forth very quick. And they also have the opportunity before the simulation to discuss on private discussion boards on my courses with their group their strategy coming into it. And I tell them honestly, the groups that do that are going to have a real advantage because it starts going very quickly. And if you've got a game plan ahead of time, and others don't especially, you're at a real advantage. Oddly enough, the last 2 times I've run it, the Russians have run the show. Not because they have more power. That's the other odd thing, is they almost internalize the sense that the U.S. has all the bombs, and the Russians are weak, and Europe kind of follows along, and which is always interesting. But the Russians usually, the last 2 times, have really usurped the leadership role by adopting humanitarian values first and foremost, and then subverting those to their own ends and saying, we'll have more of a humanitarian disaster if you start bombing, or those types of things. Or we don't support some sort of rogue element in international affairs that comes out and bombs without UN approval or what have you. And so the end point oftentimes is very different from reality. And I think the students go in thinking either we're going to get exactly how things went, or I'm going to fix it, right? I know it went wrong, and I know how we can fix this. They don't understand that everyone else has a veto on whether they can do that. And so we will get anywhere from still mired in crisis, nothing happening, to diplomatic solution that's incredibly creative and we wish would have happened in reality, to World War III. I mean, maybe not that bad, but threats between Russia and the United States that, wow, we really don't want to go there. Then when they write the reflections, I tell them, you're not writing about the real event. You're going to use concepts that were developed to understand the real event, but you're going to write about what actually happened. And the knowledge of the real event should help you leverage a sense of the way in which your ethical outlook and others' ethical kind of actions led to an interesting conclusion. And so yeah, I've been running this. I used to run it for intro international relations courses at Ohio, and now I get to run it in an actual international ethics course, which has been great because I can really highlight the way in which it's not all dog-eat-dog power dynamics, power politics. What you say can really matter. Who you can get to agree with your kind of position of right, it really matters a great deal. And international politics is oftentimes accepting the good over the ideal, right? And I think a lot of them get that out of it. I'll just say, one more thing that as another tough thing to do is to pick the players. I've started to ask them if they to volunteer, depending on who they think they want to be. And that worked fairly well one semester. This semester I didn't get anyone. I only had one student volunteer. And I spend a lot of time on the, I forget what the site is where we can see their pictures, so that I can recall, okay, who's this student that speaks up in class or has this viewpoint, to put them in the right role. And here's where a lot of times I do put students in roles that are a bit of a juxtaposition from their normal everyday mode of operating. So I had a pacifist, a committed pacifist, play Slobodan Milosevic. And he did fantastically. He did really well. And I think previous to this, I had someone who was excited to be Slobodan Milosevic, and it was a disaster. I mean, it didn't fall apart, but he got a little bit too goofy, sadistic, right? This is a real terrible thing that happened. You don't take it lightly. Kind of, yeah. But the funny thing was, the goofy, sadistic guy shot himself in the foot so much quicker than the pacifist. To be openly malevolent is not a good strategy usually. The pacifistic guy tried to find the good and said, well, I'm fighting for my people, and we've got a national homeland, and all this kind of rhetoric about that. So it's been a great experience, and I placed it right after her first exam, like I said, and so even if they bomb the exam, they don't drop the class because they're looking forward to the simulation, and then it always goes well. They usually all get very good grades, and not because it's easy, and I have students that come back. Well, I was at OU for 3 years, and I had students that came back to me in year 3 that had taken me the first year I was there, that said it was still the most fun thing, or best thing they had done in college yet. Like, they learned the most in that kind of power-packed week. And I have lots that can we do more of these? Can we do them for 4 weeks? And that's where I go, you could, but not in my class, right? We need to actually learn some of these concepts by me reading about them, me transmitting them. We can't just play act the whole time. So yeah, that's how I approach this, right? I'm opposed to active learning if it's an excuse, or if it takes the place for rigor. I'm opposed to it if it really does make our lives that much harder because we've got enough on our plate as it is. But I think if it's done right, it can serve rigor, and it can serve to kind of make not only your teaching evals go up, but you're not doing as much grading maybe, or grading's not as big of a drudgery, or your classroom experience is more pleasant because your students are more engaged, so you're not pulling teeth the whole semester. And all those things, at the end of the day, they more than make up for the front end work that went into creating this. Yeah, please.
Yeah, I think one of your subjects was something about drones.
Sure, yeah.
There's a movie, I haven't seen it, but I've heard about it. I think it's called Eye in the Sky or something.
Okay.
About a guy who's a drone pilot, and he has a crisis of conscience. And I don't know if you've assigned that or used that, but it might be
Yeah, is that Ethan Hawke? Is that, or is it a docu? Okay, yeah, I haven't seen it yet. That class is still developing. Lots of interesting ideas are happening, and honestly, the level of sophistication I get with the roundtables has contributed to my research in a big way. So I have an article I'm working on with respect to the topic, and some of the conclusions I've come to or the ideas I've had have been sparked by students who thought about something from a different direction than I did and had the time to actually do it, I had a student, I had two military history buffs the first time I taught this, and they kept coming back to, how is this different than the air power revolution, right? Air power changed a lot, but we're not all dead, and there's still such a thing as a civilian versus a combatant, even though we could aim at civilians and all this stuff. And I just went, that's the case, right? That's what you compare this to, and that's what my research is on now. Yeah, it's been very useful, and like I said, I don't know how many teach classes where there's a danger that the students think you're indoctrinating them or something like that with whatever, but the debates are so useful with respect to those dilemmas, right? There's a right answer, or at least you're closer to the right answer than others. But you can't go there with the students, even when it's really obvious. I mean, I teach, when I do American foreign policy, we do a bit on things that I think there are no reasonable grounds for saying this is okay, things like torture, right? But there is literature that says this is okay in some situations. And so I want them to read it, and I want them to understand it, but I really am not, I don't feel like with those topics I'm doing my job if they come out going, Dick Cheney's got a point. Not so bad. I want them to understand that point, but so the debates are oftentimes a vehicle for them to understand in an honest discussion where it's not about the loudest voice in the room or who's got the most stars on their shirt or something like that. This argument loses, right? It just doesn't have as much to it, and so it's very useful for that purpose.
Can you give an example of active learning taking the place of rigor? Just for example.
Yeah. So when I designed a course at OU called International Peace, and it should be part of my au revoir, but because I'm a just war theorist at heart, and if you're a just war theorist worth his salt, you should be concerned with peace as the end goal. But there's a really vast literature that deals with peace building and things like that I hadn't really dug into. And so I decided, well, that my one active learning thing, I'm going to have them do group projects where they do a bunch of research for me, essentially, right, on maybe some peace-building endeavors that I don't know enough about to speak intelligently. And I can do the conceptual stuff easily. I'll just read a few pieces and come present them. But I can't rattle off the ins and outs of what happened in Cote d'Ivoire and East Timor and all these number of peace-building endeavors. So I'll have them go really in depth, so that I'll do the conceptual stuff, and then they'll take a whole class period to teach this other teach our students about a case and get really in there. The problem was with the logistics of the course, so I had groups of 5 or 6. It's a bit large. Some don't pull their weight, some do. Some come stoned to their presentation. I had that happen, and did not stand up. He just sat there and kind of. His was on Libya, and it was about the Libya intervention by NATO in 2011, and all he talked about was the Benghazi attacks that killed the ambassador. I went, that was a little later, buddy. So what ended up happening is I should have done the work, right? And given them an active learning that was a little more structured, was less dependent on them picking up a bunch of slack and organizing themselves in this unwieldy group. And some groups did really well, but usually that was the groups where 3 of the people knew each other and they just kind of take over, right? And you're just not going to get that every time. And so the rigor of the course was damaged by that. I had a little less work, I guess, than I otherwise would have, but I don't think the students got a lot out of it. I think they saw it as drudgery and me treating them like high school kids because they had to, get up with their PowerPoint and do that kind of thing. Which is not to say presentations aren't a good idea. It's just in that particular class, I think I went overboard. I also personally, from my undergrad days, this is a totally personal thing. I hated when professors, almost like on a weekly basis, would go, okay, I want you to team up with you, and you don't know each other, and then you're gonna come up with some idea. You write it down right now, and then we're gonna talk about it, right? And all the social obstacles to actually getting down to work are just so big when you do that, right? I'm nervous about meeting this person. I gotta, do they want to talk to me? Do I want to talk to them? Then I got to get up and say something, and I hope it's intelligent. I didn't drink my coffee today, and that kind of stuff seemed to me like lost class periods when I was an undergrad. And I just went, what are my parents paying you for in that case? So, yeah, I don't know if there's an absolute limit on the quantity, but I think it has to be tied to, and it can be something that helps you strategically lessen your workload, but usually that's a function of the classroom environment being improved, your grading being stretched out maybe, the papers being improved, not so much they're doing the research for me or they're taking over the class for me so that I don't have to develop a really dynamic lecture this time or something like that. That's where I think there's a danger, maybe, that it gets a bit gimmicky.
Well, so here's why I got so excited talking to Ben. When he says things like, you really need the structure there, right, for the active learning to take off and for students to have a really good experience. We find that again and again and again and again and again. Talking with faculty who've tried group projects or tried active learning stuff and thought, well, I'm a researcher, right? I'm an academic. It's the digging into the research that I've found really valuable myself. Students are like, nah, that's stupid. Why would I do that?
Yeah.
And so trying to figure out how to present it to them in such a way, like the simulation or these debates.
They know it's coming, yeah.
Right.
They kind of get hyped up the whole
Yeah.
semester. Yeah. And every once in a while I'll throw something out that's random. Like the other day, so we're reading a guy named Chris Coker in my military tech course. And he's a kind of philosopher by trade, but he writes about war and technology. And so he's talking about Plato and Socrates and Aristotle and then bringing in Heidegger and I mean, he's checking off all the boxes, right? Here's what Kant would have thought and all this stuff. And then his book could have been half the length because he's talking about every movie he's ever seen and how it fits. And I told him, look, he's British, so he's not going to tell you what he's going to say first and then say it. He's just going to start babbling, and then by the end you'll maybe understand it. I realized it was beating them up. They were really having a rough go of it because with that I have to kind of challenge them to all right, let's think about what he's saying here. Let's pause and they were just like, I can't do it anymore, And so I came into class yesterday and I said, okay, we're going to treat you like high school students for a bit, chuckle. I've got 3 questions here. I want you to just write 3-sentence answers to each one. I go, okay, all right. But then the question is, what does it mean to be human? Question 1. They're like, 3 sentences? 3 sentences. What role does technology play in our humanity? What role does conflict play in our humanity? And then, so that took 10 minutes or so. And then I said, okay, who's proud of who wants to offer their answer, right? And gosh, a number of hands shot up, right? And they weren't spouting what the book had been telling them. They were saying, that's where I wanted to get to. I wanted us to get to, we'd been reading this and being hammered with his perspective, and he wasn't really good at offering opposing perspectives and then playing with them. He was just, this is what it is, right? And so then we got opposite perspectives, and we could kind of go from there. And then I went into the lecture. But that, 15 minutes, right? I didn't make them get in groups and discuss and, all that stuff. Because then just the getting in groups part takes 10 minutes. And the discussion part, some of them are just going to sit there and go, yeah.
Any other questions or thoughts? Thank you, Ben. This
Yeah,
was
thank you.
fabulous. Really appreciate your time.
And feel free, I didn't bring cards, but you can find me on political science. If you want any more of these kind of examples or anything, I'd be happy to offer them up. And, I was honored to do this, but I don't consider myself an active learning expert at all. This is just necessity, right? I was teaching a 3-4 at OU. I had to find a way to get good teaching evals and not be slammed with stuff, right? And that's how this happens. So.
That's a beautiful thing, though. Getting not slammed is brilliant. So I wanted to say something, too. Ben's use of active learning reminds me a lot of Corey Patak's use of active learning. He does a kind of simulation in his large biology lecture. We have a video of his Teachers on Teaching talk that he did about a year ago or so.
Corey, last name PTA.
PTAK. And it's on our website. And I'll send a link out with the feedback survey we usually do for this event. So you'll have both this. We recorded this, right? So this will be on our website eventually once it's captioned.
I forgot to ask you a question.
Yeah. No, go ahead.
How many students do you have in your class?
So for the intro, it's 32. Or no, I should say 40 is the cap. But usually I have around 35, 30, something like that. But that simulation I've run with 80 before. And I just add more people, right?
From the other classes or something?
I used to do large lectures at Ohio. Once you go past 80, it's problematic, highly problematic. With my upper level here, it's 30 max. That is about the highest number you can do these kind of roundtables. Otherwise, you've got 8 people in front of the classroom. No one gets really good comments.